This is the Comics Alternative Eurocomics. Reviews of Luisa, Now and Then, and Green Almonds, Letters from Palestine. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Eurocomics. I'm Derek.
And I'm Pascal, and we are two guys with advanced degrees talking about comics.
That's right, comics in translation. And on this month's episode, Pascal and I are going to look at a couple of very interesting titles. We're going to begin with Carole Maurel's Luisa, Now and Then. And then after that, we're going to check out Green Almonds, Letters from Palestine by Anaële and Delphine Hermans. But before we get to those titles, we want to let all of you guys know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Eurocomics is brought to you by those wonderful people at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts can be anywhere from 20 to 35% off of the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some mind-blowing specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off the cover price. Sometimes 50% off cover. But occasionally, you can find discounts that are even more impressive than that.
And this month, if you go to the Humanoids section of Discount Comic Book Service, you can find a title in translation, Superman is Not Jewish, But I Am Kinda, by Jimmy Beaumont and Emily Boudet, and that's 30% off. And if we check the Lionfort page, which is the publisher of Green Almonds, we can find Quantum Mechanics, a graphic novel by Jeff Weigel, and that's also 30% off, only $9.09. Great deal.
That's right. There's no better way of finding your comics in translation than by going to Discount Comic Book Service. Their website is dcbservice.com. You gotta go there for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your titles there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that Pascal and Derek sent you.
Thank you.
So Pascal, I don't know how you feel, but it seems that every month I'm feeling more and more that there's a wealth of material for us to choose from, of new releases, of works in translation, that it becomes kind of difficult. And I know that you and I were going back and forth about what to discuss for the month of August. And we had a lot of choices. And unfortunately, there's certain things we couldn't discuss. And we did decide on two titles. So, I mean, do you think that there's just a wealth of material, like more than there was, let's say, 5 years ago?
I think it's increasing exponentially. And because American publishers are tapping into the well of stuff coming out of Europe, especially on the Franco-Belgian market, and that market is oversaturated with books. I mean, they publish and that's a problem, actually. It's an issue. There's so many books coming out every month that it's impossible for bookstore to keep them on the shelf long enough for people to even know they exist. Mm-hmm. So it's I understand, that this is growing here because they have so much to pull from, and well, the Humanoids book, Luisa Now and Then. Sorry, it's a pretty big book, I think, for Humanoids. But the Green Almond book is a much smaller publisher.
Yeah,
it's more obscure, and it's mm-hmm. already, I think, it came out in 2011, I think. originally. Yeah.
Well, I mean, of the two examples that you're pulling from, the publishers, Humanoids and then Lionforge, Humanoids is doing more, as we'll discuss in a few moments. And then we have Lionforge, which over the past couple of years seemed to have kind of like sprouted up like a mushroom almost out of nowhere. And then we have other publishers like Dark Horse and especially IDW, Dean Mullaney's imprint, Hero Comics. It's just, I think there's so many publishers that are doing more with comics in translation, especially as you put it, the Franco-Belgian variety, that it really is impressive. And it's almost overwhelming for us to choose, which title to look at each month.
Yeah, it is. And sorry if I didn't mean that Lionforge is a small publisher. I meant the original publisher, Varum, the original publisher of Green Almond is a small publisher in Belgium. So they are tapping into small imprints. So that's why there is so much, it's like they've already looked at the big ones and they're looking into like smaller publishing houses. So
yeah,
it's kind of interesting. And yeah, it's going to be tough to keep up, but we try.
Well, let's go ahead and start talking about the titles that we actually did choose to discuss for the month of August. And we're going to begin with Carole Maurel's Luisa, Now and Then. And this is coming from Humanoids. And it's actually Humanoids' new Life-Drawn imprint. And this was released back in June. So it hadn't been out that long. Maybe we should start by talking a little about what Life-Drawn is. The way that Humanoids describes Life-Drawn is that it's stories that, and I'm paraphrasing here, that are based more on Earth than on stars. Because not all of their previous material, but most, I think, of the things that they had published were primarily science fiction or fantasy in nature. But now, earlier this year, they began publishing books that were more realistic in nature, like some autobiographies, some, as Luisa, Now and Then, straight-laced fiction. And so it is, in many ways, really different from some of the stuff, most of the stuff, I think, that they did before. I mean, they were doing some of this stuff earlier, but it just wasn't as prominent. And I know that in the first wave of Life-Drawn titles, there was Luisa that we're going to be discussing, this first volume of Kabul Disco, the first volume of Vietnamese Memories, and then I don't know much about this one, Madame Cat.
Yeah.
And then just recently, or not too long ago, maybe a month and a half ago, they announced the second wave of Life-Drawn books. Marilyn's Monster, the second volume of Kabul Disco, Superman, the one that you mentioned a moment ago, Superman Isn't Jewish, But I Am Kind of, New York Marathon, Hedy Lamarr, An Incredible Life, and then the second volume of Vietnamese Memories. So, I mean, there again, we said a moment ago that Humanoids is doing more. They're doing a lot with this imprint.
Yes, they are, and from the U.S. publishing perspective, because of what Humanoids has been kind of pushing forward the last 10 years or so, they were focusing on the Mobius, Jodorowsky stuff, the sci-fi core things. But historically, Humanoids, the French version, Humanoids Associés, they were more open to other things. And especially a title I'm thinking about is that there's a flagship title for Humanoids in France is Monsieur Jean, the Dupuy and Berberian book. And that's very grounded in everyday life. It's the life. It's actually was still published by Drawn and Quarterly here in English. They had 2 volumes. They have one that just came out not long ago, and Humanoids put one out, but it's kind of interesting that there was no space for it. Maybe in the Humanoids catalog when they first came out on the U.S. market. So I'm not surprised that they have this, live drawn imprint when they've touched on those kind of more grounded everyday life testimonial type topics before.
Yeah, and many of these books are memoirish or autobiographical in nature, and those tend to be quite popular with readers and especially with libraries and in the classroom. So
yeah,
they can't go wrong there. Now, Luisa, Now and Then. Now, this is another interesting thing we can discuss. It's translated by Nanette McGinnis, but as they call it, the English language adaptation is by Mariko Tamaki. And Mariko Tamaki is the co-author of this one, Summer and Skim, along with her cousin, Jillian Tamaki. I always find it interesting, the difference between translation and adaptation. What can you tell me about the difference? What do you know?
Well, it's a difference that I think and probably frustrates a lot of translators. Because as a translator, you're supposed to translate the meaning and therefore adapt things to the culture. And that's part of the job, the adaptation part. I feel, and I don't want to, I'm sure Mariko Tamaki was interested in a project and she brought something to it. I don't want to diminish her work, but I really feel like it is kind of a marketing thing that they are asking her to tweak the language of this book to make it sound more modern or connected with the U.S. culture more. And it is true that the original in French, I was reading some reviews. Unfortunately, I could not access the French version to read it. But I read a lot of discussions about the language is very funny. There's a lot of one-liners. Yeah, in your original French. There are like one-liners and like funny wordplay and things. That because of the characters coming from 2 different period of time, so they use the same slangs, things like that. And I think that's probably why they thought, well, let's have let's do this adaptation thing. But I think slapping, especially it's right on the cover, putting Mariko Tamaki's name on there connects the book to what she's known for, which makes sense thematically. I think the work she did with her cousin, is related thematically. It's the same thing when I forgot what publisher published Barbarella, Jean-Claude Forest's sci-fi.
Well, I know it was classic. I know that Humanoids published it in the US.
That one was adapted by Kelly Sue Got Married.
Right.
And that also makes sense.
I think she translated it.
She adapted it.
I thought it was a retranslation.
No, it was adaptation. It was not. Yeah, she doesn't speak French enough to do that. Yeah.
Well, I didn't know. I thought that maybe she was very fluent in French. So you're suggesting to some degree that this is kind of a marketing ploy. Maybe ploy is not the right word. In other words, names that are recognizable like Mariko Tamaki and Kelly Sue Got Married, when they adapt a work that's already been translated, that gives or that potentially could give the book a little extra push just because their name is associated with it.
Yeah, it's kind of like they are endorsing it in a way, which is fine. It's not a big issue, and I don't know exactly how they work with a translator. And you can tell that some of in the book, the language flows and it feels natural. But.
Yeah, I thought things flowed and felt natural in Luisa. In fact, let's start talking about Luisa Now and Then and what this is all about. How would you encapsulate the premise of this book?
Well, to me, this book uses a device that we have seen before in movies or prose, where there's a timeline that is twisted, and the same character has an opportunity to meet herself at a different time period. And usually, when this is done, it's a travel, character traveling back in time to their youth, and maybe they can change something and fix something. It's about nostalgia. I think I'm thinking about Distant Neighborhood, the Jiro Taniguchi book. Mm-hmm. Thinking about Peggy Sue Got Married, the Coppola movie. That's the device. And in this book is the premise is, it's the same idea, except it's reversed. It's the young character from the past who's going to
the young Luisa.
Young Luisa traveling from 1995 to 2013 and meet her 30-plus-year-old self, and so they can come to terms with basically the way she dealt with homosexual feelings she had as a young person, mm-hmm. and then now she's still having trouble dealing with in her 30s, and her young self comes to her, and there's this kind of reckoning, and we can imagine that things will change. We don't want to spoil the ending, but
that's right. So I'm glad that you mentioned the homosexual aspect of it, mm-hmm. and Louisa's feelings for her friend. Oh God, her young friend, Lucy. Yes, Lucy.
Uh-huh.
Because that is, I think I saw it. That's what you see on the book's back, on the blurb.
Mm-hmm.
And as I was reading this book, I kept wondering, at what point are we going to get to that? And it doesn't occur until, we see Lucy, I can't remember at what point, but the homosexual wranglings, I guess, that she has doesn't really begin until around
50.
Page 100, actually.
Well, there's the scene, page 55. That's the first kiss, but that's a flashback.
Yeah, there's the first. Okay, you're right. There's that. But even then, I would argue it doesn't become prominent until we get more into the book. So I think I would argue that the first third of this book deals with the high concept of time travel, right? The young mm-hmm. Luisa coming to the future inadvertently, and we can mention what I mean by that. And seeing the older Luisa, and then hilarity ensues, right?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And it does. There's a lot of funny things that go on, and as mm-hmm. you might expect, there are a lot of problems that occur, and so Maurel plays that out. But then after we get into the first third of this book, then I think things take a much more serious turn. Would you agree?
Yes, that's true. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, especially when it comes to feelings of sexuality and trying to define identity in that way.
Yes. And I think one of the, like I said, it's the interesting thing about the book as a whole is that it uses that trope I was talking about, we've seen before, but it twists it. It does something new with it, I think. Especially in the rapport between the two characters.
Mm-hmm, exactly. Now, I said a moment ago that the young Luisa inadvertently comes to the future. And when we see her at the very beginning of this book, she's on a bus and mm-hmm. she's listening to her Walkman.
Yes.
To tell you what period of time she comes from, the 1990s. And she is basically not paying attention to anything. She's like half asleep. And when the bus driver says, okay, we're here, we're at the end, you need to get off the bus. So young Luisa gets off the bus and has no clue where she is. And she doesn't even, then she eventually realizes she's in Paris, and she says, what am I doing in Paris? Because mm-hmm. she comes from what smaller town?
Coudray.
Mm-hmm.
That's where she's trying to get to, yeah.
Right. And we don't know at first why she's on that bus and how she got from Coudray to Paris in the future. We learn later as we read on, there's much more context about why she's on that bus and, how she ends up there. So she is in Paris in 2013, and she's in a bind because she doesn't know where she is. She wants to call home. However, she needs to buy a phone card, but the only money she has are French francs, and she can't use them because, of course, France uses the euro. And so there are a lot of things like this that go on. And it's at this point where she's struggling and she's trying to figure out what's going on and how can she get home, how can she get in touch with her mother, that she meets a character who will become a major player in this narrative, Sasha. Yes. And so Sasha is a young woman about the age of the older Luisa, I assume. And Sasha kind of feels sorry for the younger Luisa and tries to help her, but is confounded, and she doesn't really understand what the younger Luisa is saying. She, well, I got on a bus. I'm from, what is the name of that town?
Coudray.
And in fact, I think Sasha even tries to look up the mother in Coudray and can't find that information. And so at one point, she even thinks that the younger Luisa is pulling her leg. Yeah. But she ends up taking her home and caring for her. Now, as fate would have it, of course, Sasha lives in the exact same apartment building as the older Luisa.
There's the other connection because this is actually Louisa's aunt's, right? Or Aurelia, that's her apartment building.
Right. Yeah. I just think that it's rather fortuitous that Sasha's in this building as well. So, but it's a plot premise and you got to go with it. And in fact, on that matter, let me just say a few things. You mentioned a moment ago that we've seen this premise before, and you're right, we have. And I do think that Maurel gives it a different twist at times, one example of which you've already mentioned, time traveling forward instead of going back. However, there are things that happen in the story that seem to be a tad predictable to me. I mean, I had no problem with that, but I just knew that it was going to happen.
Okay.
With a premise like this. And so, I mean, that's, I think, one of the dangers of using a trope that is fairly common is that you may get your reader feeling that they can predict what may happen. Although I do think that Maurel does take different directions at times. And so, it doesn't diminish from the enjoyment of the narrative at all.
I think one thing she doesn't, that she doesn't present, I mean, usually in those types of stories, there's a moment of realization of a character. Oh, I am now, back in time. And in those two examples I was talking about, the character is actually doesn't have a double. They are just in the body of the person, right? But as a young person, whether it's Peggy Sue Got Married or it's Kathleen Turner, everybody sees her as a young woman, even though she is older in the Coppola movie. And in the Taniguchi book, it's a 40-year-old man who ends up in the 12-year-old, I think 14-year-old body of, is self in the past. But here they meet each other. And I think that so the old self, young self are in, so they actually meet each other, and their interaction to me was surprising because I was expecting there's no real awe about how crazy this is. Like, oh, this is an opportunity. This is me as a young person, or this is me as an old. They because of their personalities, it's very electric. There's a lot of fighting, and they're not nice to each other. And then when I was reading, it was like, really? This is kind of unusual. I don't know if you felt that way.
Yeah, well, it's a little surprising that the young Luisa doesn't really think much about it, right? It's like, oh, this is my older self. The older Luisa, it's not so much that she is blasé about this. She resists it. I mean, there's something about this that really disturbs her. And I think that's a hint as to what we can expect later in the narrative in terms of the older Luisa confronting certain feelings that she used to have and may still harbor. Well, she does still harbor, as we learn, that she must confront. Because Luisa, the older Luisa, the contemporary 2013 Luisa, is resistant to this. And so for a while, she doesn't want to have anything to do with the younger self. But then she ends up taking her in, and in order to explain how she looks so much, the younger one looks so much like the older one, she says, well, this is a cousin that I didn't know I had, and she looks a lot like me.
And she has the same name because of her grandmother.
Exactly.
She finds an excuse.
It's a common name in the family that they use.
Yeah.
So I think that Maurel handles that really well.
And I would like to just backtrack a little bit to the beginning of the book. I was thinking about, especially the setup. We talked about she comes in a bus and gets out of the bus, and she is, in 2013, coming from 1995. At this point, she doesn't know it. What's happening. Young Luisa doesn't know it. Mm-hmm. What I find interesting at this point in the story is that the focus changes, and we have this little scene where 2013 Luisa is having a conversation with her friend Farid, right? Mm-hmm. And in that conversation, something happens that it is not. I wish there was a little translation note, maybe, because I don't know if you actually saw what happened, but page 13.
Yeah.
In the middle of the conversation, right? Old Luisa, or 2013 Luisa, she's not that old,
gives Farid a DVD.
Exactly. She gives a DVD back. Oh no, she bought a DVD for a friend, and she gives it to her. And she says, I've got you a DVD. It's beautiful. It made me nostalgic. And he says, for what? Adolescence and constant anxiety. And you see a panel where she's holding the DVD, right? Mm-hmm. This is an actual movie that came out in France in 2012. It's called Camille Redouble, or in English, it's translated Camille Rewinds. But it was actually, I looked it up. It's unfortunately not available in the States. It came out in the UK and maybe at a few festivals here. And it was actually a pretty successful movie in France. And this movie is basically a Peggy Sue Got Married scenario. Mm-hmm. It's a young woman who was in love with a boy when she was in high school, but never explored it, and then she gets drunk and she wakes up as a teenager in high school years, back in time, 20 years, and she has another chance at that love. But the actress plays the part of the young teenager, but as a 40-year-old woman. So she's dressed like a teenager, but she's actually that older woman. So to me, it was kind of, I didn't know what to think about this. Like that, I was thinking as a reader, if you don't know what's happening in the story, it's like, why is this detail there? It's like a sign to tell us, hey, that's what we're going to do here.
Okay, well, let me tell. Okay, see, I didn't know what that movie was about, or I assumed from the title that it may have something to do with going back or going forward in time. And I didn't know the context, but I think I understood from those passages, pages 13 and 14, when the 2013 Luisa and her friend Farid are having this conversation and they're talking about this film. I got from the context what it was about, or generally what it was about, and I thought that makes sense because that's what this book is about in many ways. And I thought that as a narrative road sign, if you will. In other words, this is a signifying moment that suggests what's about to happen, what we're about to read.
Yeah, and I was torn between this being, because they don't really make a lot out of it, but at the same time, I feel like maybe it's a little heavy-handed. I don't know.
I think you could make the argument that it may be a tad heavy-handed. I think it works.
Yeah, and I think if you take the perspective of a reader, and now we completely ruined it for any reader listening to this podcast, by the way, who has no idea of the premise and is just reading the book straight through, then that might be something they go back after and say, "Oh, yeah, that's why," So,
well, I mean, you can get the premise of the book by looking at the the back cover blurb.
Yeah, but if you don't read that, let's imagine you don't read it. I like to, it's kind of because they are obviously thinking about the way they're staging this. I mean, the structure actually of the whole graphic novel is quite complex. There's a lot of time shifts. There's a color coding, like black and white for the flashbacks, and they kind of
it's 1995 parts.
Yes, and it's a little non-linear. It goes back and forth, so you have to kind of pay attention. But I think it's well structured. It works well, so you can tell they put some thought into it. So it's kind of sad that they ruin it with the blurb or spoil it. I don't know.
Well, I mean, that's what you do with a back cover and inside flap blurb.
There's
I used to write those things, so I mean, I know all about that.
Yeah, and they have their function. I mean, supposed to get people to read the book, right?
Yeah, exactly.
There's one little detail like this, similar to maybe the DVD, although this one is not actually mentioned by the characters, that I found interesting in the book, is when you have a time traveling situation, there's often some device, right? Some rule in the story. Like, how does this happen, right? So here we have the bus ride. That's what I identified at first. I think, okay, the bus ride is the metaphorically the time traveling. But right. I noticed at the very beginning, I mean, the first panel, like you said, she's listening to a Walkman, and every single time she's listening to music in the story, there's a time shift or something happens. And I found it interesting because nobody mentions it. It's just there. So I know this, like page 126. It's old Lisa who listens to the Walkman, and then we change time period. There's another on page 229. It's Sasha who plays the piano, and there's this strange thing that happens to young Luisa where she evaporates a little bit. Like there are certain points in the story where her existence in this time comes into peril a little bit, right? Like she doesn't belong here, so there's this weird effect, right, where she is almost becoming smoke in a way. That's the most fantastical thing in the book, visually speaking, right?
And what page is that?
So this one is on 219. It's a little different. It's not the Walkman, but there's this little scene where Sasha is playing the piano.
I see.
And
yes. And you have those little bubble things.
Yes.
That begin to appear. You know, I had not noticed the potential significance of music in terms of time. That's interesting.
And it is not mentioned by any of the characters except, well, here she says, what she mentioned, you're playing the piano, but that connection with the Walkman, I thought, was definitely there. And I thought it was kind of an interesting idea, and that it's just peppered and we don't talk about it, but you can think about it the way you like.
And, that's one of the things that's enjoyable about this book is that Maurel uses a lot of these little cues and sometimes twists and tricks that you don't expect. So, like, for instance, the night that I think that the older Luisa takes her younger self out with some friends, and then the younger Luisa drinks a couple of glasses of wine and gets drunk. And there's a scene where one touches the other, and there's, I mentioned those weird bubble images. And something happens when one touches the other, and you see those images and they pull away from one another and they don't know what happened. And as a reader, I had no clue what happened. But then if you read on, then you realize that what those images, those little bubble-like images seem to represent is kind of an evaporation, or something's going on in terms of an existence within the current plane, time plane. And I think one of the twists is that they may be the same people from the same person from different times, but in one time in 2013, where both of them are, they can't touch one another. And if they do, something's going to happen, and something does happen. We won't give anything away. I think it's somewhat predictable what happens. I mean, when it actually did happen, I thought, okay, I expected this at some point. But again, I thought that was an interesting twist.
Yeah, it's pretty, and they don't overdo it. They don't spend too much time on the. I mean, it's for a reason in the story, so, but on the kind of fantastical aspect of it.
Right. Another thing that I really appreciate about this book is the minimalism of character that Maurel is playing with. And so I like this really limited cast. And so, I mean, for all practical purposes, we have 5 people. Okay. There's the younger Luisa. There's the older Luisa. There's Sasha. There's Farid. And then there's Luisa's mother. And even though we don't really see her in the present until the end of the book, and I'm not giving anything away here because you don't know what the relationship between Luisa and her mother will be until you actually get there. But she's mentioned throughout, and we do see her in flashbacks. So, and she does become quite a controlling presence in the narrative. So even though she's absent, she's present in terms of the way that Luisa sees herself, both the younger and the older.
Yeah, she's present throughout the narrative, definitely.
Right. So I think with this limitation of just 5 characters, and the book it's not a thin book. It's about what,
close to
260 some pages, something like that. So yeah, it's kind of a hefty tome. But doing that with only 5 characters.
Basically, yeah, I would also argue that Aunt Aurelia is kind of an important kind of ghost figure too.
That's right. Yeah, she's a ghost figure. Yeah, That's I think a good way of describing it.
But like you said, it's a lengthy book, but I think in terms of rhythm, she does not hesitate to have like silent passages or panels to kind of take a break in the action. It's not super dense, and I like that. It's very fluid,
right?
And that works very well.
And earlier you were mentioning the wit or the humor, and I think that's another thing that's very prominent in the text, and I appreciated that, and also the intelligence of the dialogue.
Yes, and maybe Mariko Tamaki is, responsible for that in English.
Now,
let's hope.
Are you aware of any other works by Carole Maurel?
Yes, I've heard of another book, but in French. She's published about 7 books. Like her first book was published in 2012 in France, but she has not had any other work in translation. This is our first.
Okay.
Which is the same for Delphine and Anaële Hermans for Green Almond.
The next
it's
book,
their first, it's their first English translated book. And actually this, the Luisa Now and Then was her third book.
Yeah.
So
yeah, the author blurb on the back inside flap. So she has an anthology project, The Purple Chronicles, and she has her own book, I guess, Make Yourself at Home, which came out in 2013. And then another book, The Apocalypse According to Magda.
Mm-hmm. And there's also Écume 2017, and and Waiting for Bojangles. That's 2017.
Waiting for Bojangles?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Looking at the French roster here, but that's by a different writer. She's drawing for another writer. So she's been publishing the last 7 years, they say, on this on her French bibliography, but she has a kind of a loose art style that's very pleasant and good use of color as well. It's,
now that we're talking about the prominence or the well-knownness of a particular name, or at least in translation, I think that it's interesting that the 2 texts that we're looking at this month are by creators whose presence to English speakers have been more or less absent, which is different from, let's say, the last few works that a few months where we've looked at Jodorowsky, David B., Zepp, Mobius. I mean, these are names that people
household
recognize.
names. Yeah, these are definitely the newest, new generation of female cartoonists out of Europe. Belgium for the Hermans, and France for Carole Maurel. Yeah, she was born in 1980. So,
who? Maurel?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay. Well, you've mentioned Green Almonds a few times. Let's go ahead and transition into that text now.
Let's do that.
Yes. Now, this book, Green Almonds, Letters from Palestine by Anaële and Delphine Hermans, or Hermans. This is a Line Forge book, and this came out last month, July. And as you mentioned, this is their first work translated into English. Now, I know that Delphine is, she's the illustrator. And
yes.
So she's the one who would have had other works that could possibly be translated. And Anaële is, I can't remember, what does she do for a living? I can't recall.
She's a novelist.
Worker.
Yeah, but she also wrote a novel.
Okay. Yeah.
And she's actually collaborated with her sister on another book.
Oh, okay.
Delphine published 3 graphic novels, and Green Almonds is her first one from 2011 originally in the French release, and she has 2 more, one called General Anesthesia and a dangerous ballad or wandering, I don't know how they would translate it, and yeah, one of them, which one is it? It's the Dangerous Ballads, whatever. Okay. That's written by her sister.
Okay. You mentioned the word translate. That brings me to one question that I have. I guess the first question.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
Who's the translator?
Not credited, unfortunately.
Yeah, I
What's
kept.
up,
I
Lion Forge?
looked at the beginning. I looked at the end. I looked at the indicia. It's nowhere to be found. And so, Lion Forge, yeah, if you're listening to this, you probably should enlist the translator somewhere on the title page.
That would be nice. But
Yeah.
are you reading the actual book? Because I got a PDF, so I thought maybe it's not the.
No, I'm looking at the PDF. I don't have the book.
Maybe it's it's a galley, or
Yeah, maybe the book has it. And
Yeah.
we're just looking from a PDF, which is like a galley. But okay, so the premise of this is that Anaële is going for 10 months to Bethlehem in order to volunteer for a program that, I don't know, I felt it was a little indeterminate. It had something to do with kids, but we don't know exactly much more than that. So she's going to Bethlehem for 10 months, and what she and her sister Delphine decide to do is to exchange letters, which they were going to do anyhow. And then Delphine was going to decided to use their exchange as the basis for the story that she would illustrate.
Yes, so it's autobio.
Yes,
travelogue type thing. But
I call it an epistolary memoir.
Okay.
Because it's because it's epistolary. It's based on letters.
Yeah, that I agree with that. But in the form, we actually get the postcards that Delphine sends to Anaële. But for Anaële's story, it's actually the graphic novel, the visualized version.
Right. And that's the way that this text is structured. You have Delphine's postcard to Anaële, and then what follows is, I don't know, like a 10, 8, 12-page section, illustrated story based on Anaële's letter back to Delphine. And by my count, there are 12 exchanges between these sisters. In other words, 12 postcards and then 12 responses.
Yes.
They make up this book.
Which for 10 months doesn't seem like a lot.
No, but what they do is they have to wait until one's correspondence reaches the other until the other can respond. And so if there doesn't seem to be that many responses, actually there are 12, from Anaële, in other words, 12 sections illustrating what she was going through while she was over there, in Palestine, then it's because that Delphine would have to send the postcard in order for Anaële to respond, and then vice versa. And that takes time.
True.
They're not using email, in other words.
Well, we don't really know. That's what I was about to say. We see Anaële portrayed using computers and complaining about having to use the Arabic interface. But it's not said anywhere. We don't see, like a replica of our letters or anything like we have the postcards.
That's a good point. So the only thing we know for a fact that's going by traditional post is Delphine's postcards.
Yes. And I have to say, when I first read the book and understood the structure of it, and like you said, the epistolary nature of it, it struck me as a little unusual that the one who is going to put the story into visuals is the person who was not there. Does that strike you?
That didn't strike me as strange because Delphine is the illustrator.
Yes, but she's never been there. You know what I mean?
Right.
It's a little odd.
But she's visually representing or interpreting what her sister was going through.
Yeah, I mean, maybe her sister sent her pictures. We can imagine.
Yeah, I don't know.
Her art style is very minimalist. So, but there's a feel. I was kind of thinking about, because
it's you said minimalist. It reminds me a little bit of Marjane Satrapi.
Yeah, somewhat. But I think when the topic of the book and the fact that it's nonfiction, the focus on Palestine, there are looming shadows when you go to that topic. You cannot help but think. I mean, that's my case, but I don't know. Maybe I go straight to Joe Sacco.
Oh yeah, throughout reading the entire text, I kept thinking about Sacco's Palestine.
Mm-hmm. Or the what is it? Letters from Gaza, or is it letters? No. And I was also thinking about the Guy Delisle book about Jerusalem, because it also has a very minimalist art style. But in both cases, they were there. That's why it's a little odd to me. It's kind of a strange way of approaching this form of nonfiction graphic novel. I felt, but
I guess it is strange. I hadn't thought about that. I just assumed, well, of course, Delphine is going to be illustrating this because she's the illustrator. But you're right; it is a little strange in that she wasn't there.
But it's actually the same thing that happened with a book we discussed a few shows ago. America is beautiful. Algeria is beautiful as America.
Okay.
Yeah, it was the same principle. The writer experienced traveling and everything, and the artist was not with her. He was just representing what she was going through.
Yeah. Huh.
It's the same idea. But so let's dive into this. What happened? Was your
my take on this book?
Mm-hmm.
I enjoyed it. I thought that it became rather oppressive at times, just given the subject matter, and I found myself getting irritated and angry. And one of the things that we have throughout is that Anaële may be in Bethlehem. She may have primarily Palestinian friends and associates, but she also has Israeli friends. Now, one of the questions, a question I had earlier was, what exactly is this organization that she's going to spend 10 months working at or working for? But there are other things that are a little ambiguous and unexplained in this book. So, for instance, she keeps talking about all of these friends. How does she meet these friends? She says, my Israeli friends. Did she have these Israeli friends before? Did she meet them while she was over there? Same thing with her Palestinian friends.
And even her relationship with some of her Palestinian friends that she gets close to. Of course, I'm thinking about what's his name? Majid?
Yeah, Majdi.
Sorry,
yeah,
Majdi.
Yeah. In fact, there are a lot of friends and a lot of people in this text, but I think Majdi is the most significant because he's the one that Anaële spends the most time with and even starts to develop feelings for.
Yeah. But I always feel as a reader that, like you said, there's some information that I was not given. And I feel like they're reproducing, she's writing to her sister and they have this shared knowledge that we don't have. But she does not explain, right? In terms of, it's like we have a chance to read their exchanges and what they were talking about during this period, but there's no other information given to us. And so she'll jump from topic to topic and, like you said, not mention any background information. So we're just supposed to kind of go along with the flow. Right.
So, on the one hand, I'm with you in that sometimes the lack of information can be frustrating for us as a reader. On the other hand, given the nature of the text, that it's based on letters, it's an epistolary narrative, then if Delphine is going to include in the comics that she creates only that information that is in Anaële's letters, then Anaële's letters are not going to go into a lot of context.
True. Yes, it's a limit. I mean, it's a constraint of the format. I agree with that. There are just two instances in the book. So they say 99% of the scenes in Palestine are pictures with texts, captions. There are just very few instances of dialogue that pop in the book, and that made me think: were those dialogues transcribed in the letter? I felt especially there's a scene when she her relationship with Majdi deteriorates a bit, where there's like a pause and there's a little scene with only dialogues between her and him. Mm-hmm. And I felt that shift was a little odd.
Yeah, well, maybe that's Delphine as an adapter.
Yes.
And not a translator, yes. Yeah.
True.
I don't know, what was your take on this book?
Like you said, it's this because of the subject matter, it's you get very frustrated and with the situation of the Palestinians and the way things are portrayed. And I had the same feeling reading Sacco or reading other books. I just felt that the minimalist artwork, which in itself is fine and valid, but to me, it doesn't always convey a sense of place, maybe enough for me.
Character, yes, but I agree with you in terms of place.
Yeah, in terms of setting, even though it's very simple the way she draws, like you said, characters, you still know who is where, and I think that works well. Mm-hmm. But I was not really drawn to the sense of place. Like I could be even in the Guy Delisle book where even though he uses a very simple art style, it's not a question of Sacco is so like so much cross-hatching and details and things, but it's a different approach. But it's not a question of simplicity. It's a question of, I guess, the right detail at the right place. When she's drawing like people serving tea, I don't feel like she was there, right? She's just picturing people drinking tea, but there is something.
The artist literally wasn't there.
Exactly. So, but you know what I mean? There is a sense when you have observed that you can actually, with a few lines, make it a little more alive and interesting. So I thought that was a little lacking, but I enjoyed the structure, the idea of the letter, and I thought that was interesting. And there's quite a bit of, I think, important information. People can, if you don't have a lot of information about daily life in this area, well, you've heard of it many times, but I think it's important also to see the way people live their lives, and that it's not all like pain and suffering, that there's this weird thing where they are close to, there's like a crisis with Israeli soldiers, but they are a few yards away and they just are having tea under the olive trees. I mean, it's, going back and forth between the crisis and the moment of kind of calm. Things like that.
Even given the tragedy under which they're living, they nonetheless live. And so, they eat, they laugh, they drink, they get married, all of that. They have friendships, they get together, they dance. So, yeah, I mean, there is life, in this bleak at times context. One of the things that for me was the biggest takeaway from Green Almonds, Letters from Palestine is not the transformation, but I guess the vacillation of Anaële and what she goes through, because she seems rather gung-ho and idealistic toward the beginning.
Yeah.
But then as she progresses, as her experience undergoes a variety of encounters and frustrations, we see her, and she admits to her sister that she becomes not only frustrated, but downright depressed. She doesn't feel like doing anything. She's not motivated. And then at other times, she feels okay. And so she goes back and forth, and because of what she experiences. So for 10 months she's living here, but for all practical purposes, she's not living in this land. But nonetheless, she's affected by what's going on around her. So the people that she interacts with, her friends, her coworkers, and what they have to experience, it kind of seeps into her. And so psychologically, emotionally, it drains and at times almost cripples her.
Yes, and I think that's, like you said, that's portrayed very well. The tension she feels between, loving a new place and new people, and at the same time hating it and wanting to go away and wanting to leave, but also being sad for leaving at the same time. Which that particular feeling of I think every person who goes abroad for a long period of time, we all experience this. In this case, it's emphasized because of the political situation and the turmoils people are going through. But I think there is something, there's a truth there that is well portrayed and conveyed in the story, especially towards the end. I felt so that's definitely makes it worth the read.
Yeah,
definitely. Yes,
I do think, and it is a relatively quick read.
Yeah.
And it's a long book. It's
150 book.
Okay, it's not as long as I thought it was, but it seemed long, I guess. But okay, so that kind of contradicts what I just said. But no, it is a relatively quick read.
Yeah, you can definitely read it in one sitting.
And we should point out that this is one of quite a number of books in translation that Lion Forge has been coming out with over the past few months.
Yeah, they're short churning them out.
Yep.
So we'll have to be back to that well. Definitely.
Two books that we looked at for the month of August was Luisa, Now and Then by Carole and Maurel, and this is published by Humanoids. It's a part of their Life-Drawn imprint. And then after that, we looked at Anaële and Delphine Hermans, or Hermans, depending on how you want to pronounce it. Green Almonds, Letters from Palestine, and this is a Lion Forge book.
Two worthy titles.
That's right. Definitely check them out. And if you want to find great books in translation just like this, then you would not do wrong by checking out the website of our sponsor, which is Discount Comic Book Service. Go to dcbservice.com right now, and there you will find a whole slew of texts at great discounts, unbeatable discounts. It's a really good place to get your books in translation. That's dcbservice.com. And after you do get your text there, get in touch with us and let me and Pascal know what you're going to be reading. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way by picking up your phone and dialing 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
And if you want to reach us by email, it's 2guys@comicsalternative.com. So if you want to reach me, I'm Pascal at comicsalternative.com.
And I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com. And you can also find us all over social media. We have accounts on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, YouTube, Slack, and Discord. You can subscribe to the podcast through Apple Podcasts. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on Spotify, on TuneIn, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to the website comicsalternative.com. And we do like to hear from you.
Yes, we do.
Yes. And Pascal and I will be back next month with more good stuff. And in fact, next month's show is going to be really exciting.
Yes.
Yes, we'll leave it at that. No spoilers for what's going to be on next month's show, but we already know what we're going to be discussing. Until then, I'm Derek.
I'm Pascal.
Take care.
Au revoir.